I'm going to share some ways that shaken baby syndrome affected my daughter short term and long term. So, immediately after she was shaken, her life was changed forever. And so, she was placed on a ventilator. She had a stroke because of shaken baby syndrome, and she immediately went blind. She lost her vision. She could not make any voluntary movements. She was placed in a medical coma to allow her brain and all the swelling from the shaking to try to heal her brain and to allow it to, go back to as normal as possible, which it didn't go back to normal at all. I have a list here so I don't forget anything. So she also had to have a surgery. A surgery for feeding tube placed. So short term, right after her, brain injury, she had to get a feeding tube placed because she could have nothing by mouth. At the moment that she was shaken, nothing by mouth ever again for her entire life, which was a life of about 3 years. So she had to be tube fed. She, like I said, could no longer see. So when a baby suffers from shaken baby syndrome, it can immediately detach the retinas from the moving back and forth. Or in her case, it caused so much blood behind her eyes that eventually that blood kind of ate away at her retinas and it made her go blind. So she was blind immediately because of all the blood, but eventually her retinas did detach because of all the blood there. She immediately suffered storming and what they call toning. So when someone goes through a traumatic brain injury, they can experience something called storming. And the way that it was explained to me was her brain was firing off all these signals, and so she was constantly just during that time period of storming, she had her arms like in this what they call toning, to where they were just very stiff. She was crying like 24/7. She could not stop crying. There was nothing I could do to console her. Holding her didn't help. It almost made it worse just to hold her. She had to basically just lay there, and this happened, at the hospital. She had to lay there and go through this storming where her brain was just firing off signals and it was causing her body to react that way. So it caused some pain, and it caused her back to be out of alignment. It caused her hip to eventually come out of alignment, and she lived with a dislocated hip because at her age there was nothing they could do surgically. She went to orthopedic doctors and they could not fix her hip. So that storming and toning caused her alignment to be off and for her hip to eventually dislocate, and they couldn't do anything about it. So it caused a bunch of GI issues, gastroparesis, where again she couldn't have anything by mouth, so a feeding tube had to go directly into her intestines. Some people are familiar with a G tube, which is where it goes straight into the belly, but it had to bypass her belly since she had gastroparesis. So she couldn't have anything even in her stomach. It had to go directly into her intestines. All her medications, her feeds, everything had to go directly into her intestines. So that was another long-term effect of shaken baby syndrome. And I'm sharing this because you may not think of these long-term effects. We think of shaken baby syndrome and we know that it's bad, but we don't always know or see the long-term effects if a child survives it. So that's why I'm sharing this. She had to go to multiple therapies, physical therapy, occupational therapy. She had hydrotherapy. She had to see so many specialists, a neurologist, a GI doctor. She was in and out of the hospital a lot because it compromised her immune system, just because her brain did not function correctly. She lost almost all of her brain function, except a small amount that was connected to her brainstem. So that compromised her immune system as well. She had to have nursing care. So I guess she didn't have to have it because I could have been her caregiver 24/7, but that if you have ever been a caregiver, you can't be someone's caregiver 24/7 all the time. So she did get approved for nursing care. So a long-term effect of shaken baby syndrome was she had to have, nursing care. And she did end up with a GI infection because her GI tract was compromised due to shaken baby syndrome. She ended up in a position where she had this massive infection. They had to remove some of her intestines in an emergency surgery. She had to get on TPN, which is nutrition through your veins, because she could have nothing in her intestines at all because of that infection in surgery. So during that time, she gained some weight from this TPN because it's going directly into your veins and it's not the normal way to receive nutrients. And then she could not decrease that weight. So her GI doctor tried many different things to decrease that weight, but because of her brain and because of the TPN she had to receive, and because she could not make voluntary movements and couldn't, work off the weight, she couldn't get the weight back off. So she did, she was a bigger size, and I get that question a lot, why was she so big? And that was why. Her temperature went down constantly. Her temp stayed in the 80s a lot. And most doctors would be like, that's impossible. I've had doctors tell me that's impossible. But we took her temperature and a nurse took it every single day and it stayed in the 80s. And that had to do a lot with her brain and the only part that was functioning. And so that was also a sign eventually when it would consistently stay in the 80s that she was, her body was starting to shut down. And eventually she did pass away from her body shutting down. So she was eventually put on hospice care. So a long-term effect, she lived for 3 years after shaken baby syndrome, but a long-term effect was it did take her life. And so she was placed on hospice care. She one day just randomly vomited some fluid from her lungs. And since she had nothing in her stomach, it was alarming. So they figured out it was from her lungs and that her O2 was consistently going down and that it was probably the end of life stages for her. So she ended up on hospice care, which was a huge blessing. I am so thankful for hospice care. But that was a long-term effect of one moment in her life where she was shaken. So eventually her brain did fail her. She did not have enough brain to function an entire body. And as her body grew, that brain could just function less and less until it started to shut things down. And it did that by shutting down her lungs. Her oxygen would continuously drop. It did that by, shutting down, lowering her temperature day by day. And then so eventually that led to her taking her last breath. She did pass away peacefully. I want to throw that out there. She passed away, in our arms, at home, comfortable as she could be because of hospice care. But there was many short-term effects and long-term effects from being shaken. And we don't just know that. That's not just information that we usually just know unless someone puts it out there. So I wanted to put this information out there to help spread awareness about shaken baby syndrome, to answer any questions that you might have had about Christa if you've seen her, here and there on social media. And really my mission is to just spread awareness about this, because I never imagined this happening. I never, sometimes it's still hard for me to believe that happened to my child, that she was actually shaken. And all of these things came from that one moment that someone was either frustrated. I don't know exactly what happened that night, but was either frustrated or, she was crying. I don't know what happened because I wasn't there, but I do know that one moment changed her life forever. And I want to spread awareness about that. And I just want to share her story in hopes of also encouraging you, because, this video is more about just educating about the long-term and short-term effects, but I do a lot of videos where I share experiences in hopes of encouraging you. Because if I can get through something so terrible, such as my daughter going through shaken baby syndrome and then passing away, then you can get through what you're going through also. So that's what my channel's about. But this one was just to spread awareness and to hopefully help educate people about shaken baby syndrome.